My name is Adam. This is what I look like online. And I'm a designer, and I would really love to not care at all about CSS or talk about it or write it, or HTML for that matter. But it's oftentimes the large bottleneck in shipping product. So as a product designer, I care about the end product and bottlenecks in the way of shipping good product. So I come from this place, which is the closest place to London in the United States of America. And I've spent the last like 10 or 11 years in this place, which is one of the farthest places from London in the United States of America. Yeah, I have a couple open source projects centered around kind of CSS and accessibility, but I'm here to talk about this one. And normally, and I realize that it's a bad slide, I should actually show you the URL for this project if you ever want to go see it. And normally when I do talks, it's kind of exciting because I'm like trying to like put a story together based on tangential relationships between things. And he was like, yeah, do you want to come talk about Tachyons? And I was like, oh, I like know that story. So I didn't have much research to do, but I did have like this long timeline and sifting through a lot of thoughts. So it was kind of fun the last few days to think about this stuff. And I kind of like went back to square one and I was like, yeah, like how did Tachyons start? Like what's its origin story? And it's not as cool as Wolverines or anything like that. But I think that it was largely these two questions, which were like what is good CSS? And how much is too much CSS. And they're kind of lumped together if you think that good CSS is like performant. But I'd come back to the web after a few years working in print, and responsive design was a new thing. So I started like writing all these media queries and like fixing all these desktop designs that I had been putting together. And it quickly felt like this very broken and incorrect process because everything was like subtractive, like I was overriding things that I had already written down. So it's almost like giving instructions to a computer and being like, oh wait, no, do the opposite. And it's very hard for me to keep like all this mental information in my head no matter how long I was sitting with the code. So that was kind of like a red flag. But I'm also just like writing tons and tons of CSS, and I had this question of like, when does that stop? Like how do I manage this? When do I get to a point where I'm like, we have too much CSS, we need to refactor it? What happens if this company is around for 10 years? Like the internet's pretty new, so I was trying to plan, right? But it all came back to like trying to answer these two questions, which then started to morph into not only how do I write good CSS, but how do I move really fast while I'm doing this, and what does that mean? So it was at this time that I was working and hanging out with this dude a lot. And he is the author of Base CSS. And we both were kind of coming at front-end architecture as a like visual and product design problem because it was slowing us down a lot. We had to build apps internally, we had to build apps externally, and we're walking in and out of tons and tons of code bases, and we're finding decreasing utility in things that weren't like 100% ubiquitous. If you walk into 6 different projects, like you just don't want to have to relearn any CSS. There's such value in having something that does something across projects and you can just count on it being there. I think that that's similar to like being a back-end programmer in certain frameworks. You just have stuff that's like the same in every single project no matter what your company is doing. And there's kind of a lack of that oftentimes in the world of front end. So we were talking a lot about like visual systems and how like values should relate to each other, kind of doing a lot of complaining of like refactoring the CSS that has just like values of like multiples of 5 and the number 37 and like negative 42. And you're like, I have no idea where these things came from. Considering, like architecture for centuries has been built on like sound mathematical principles, and people just magically find these numbers. So, we were working with big teams and little teams, and there were a lot of challenges there of like building fully responsive stuff that also didn't weigh like 200 kilobytes just in the HTML and CSS part. So it was around this time that I stumbled across Nicholas Gallagher's work with Suit CSS, which stands for Simple UI Tools. And there was this like epiphany moment where he had this grid code, and there was something that only set the width of an element to 50% for like one breakpoint. I think it was like the medium breakpoint. And then he had an equivalent class for something that did the exact same thing but at a different breakpoint. And I had been thinking about media queries up to that point as like, I would take a component and then redefine it across those breakpoints, which was just this like intermingled mess that I could, again, not keep track of in my own brain. And I saw this and I was like, so this class, it doesn't redefine itself across breakpoints. It doesn't like mutate. It just has one width at one, and it's triggered at one point in one time. And then all of a sudden I wanted that for everything. So I started to build Tachyons. And I wanted to see like how far I could push that concept, because I was running into that a lot where I didn't have necessarily set patterns across breakpoints that I wanted to follow. I just knew at this breakpoint I want this element to have these visual characteristics. And I think that that's reflective of how a lot of front-end development is. It's you're contextually fixing one thing. Even if I'm building a system from the ground up, I think I'm oftentimes looking at like one really small part at a time, because I can only think about so many things. So this is the URL for that project if you want to check it out. I think he is like super rad at CSS, and it's a lot of fun to follow his work. It's been like inspirational is not even a word for how much he's influenced Tachyons. So then it was about this time too that I stumbled across Topcoat, which was really cool because these dudes were testing performance-wise their CSS. So they would have a component and they would like basically make a change to it, and it would fire off to the server, and it would graph out how quickly this component could render to the page. So you could see over time if your commits to the CSS were making this component better or worse. And like my mind was blown. I was like, oh, I want this so bad. So I had coffee with these guys and they were talking to me about their testing suite. So I, at this time, like don't like single purpose classes. I didn't like object-oriented CSS. I didn't like multi-class patterns. But I start to use the stuff they were using called Telemetry to test like how fast these things paint. And I found that like performance-wise, there's nothing better than having a like one class to one element ratio or to many element ratio. So all this stuff is kind of colliding at like probably throughout the period of time of 1 year. And so now, I don't know, I was working with a lot of different teams. I was doing some freelance and consulting work. So I didn't just have one job. And I was really trying to do a lot of like user testing of like how people consume front-end systems and how do people build UI. Like what are the problems they actually run into. A lot of people will just like straight up not solve problems. Like if you actually look at the backlogs, like there are all these visual UI bugs and people are like, I'm not even gonna dive into this. So I really found though that one of the biggest things about front-end architecture and CSS in general is documentation. Like the more that something's documented, the more somebody can understand it, the more likely they are to reuse it. And it is not enough to just have really great comments in your code. I can't tell you how many times a coworker would ask me how to use something, and I'm like, all the markup examples are in the CSS code comments, and they're like, oh, but then I'd have to read the CSS, and I'm like, ah. Okay, yeah, okay. But like that's like real actual user feedback, right? Like I can't rely on them actually reading the CSS. So I've got to find all these different ways to get them this information. And I don't think that documenting CSS is that tough, but it is really time consuming. So one of the big things we've tried to kind of work on with Tachyons is building it in a modular fashion where it is self-documenting and you can change values and you can build new components, and you just constantly have this living style guide that's representative of your system. And that's agnostic of like Tachyon styles. It really should just be able to take CSS and visualize combinations of your CSS so that people can just cut and paste components. Because through all this user testing and just like watching people and how they interact with manipulating UI, I found that people love to use magic numbers because they just want to make something work in like one context. They probably aren't going to just like tested across like every single breakpoint across like a million different devices. People and teams spend a lot of time debugging, like way too much debugging. I would love if there was an app that just like chronicled how much salary was just wasted in like finding CSS bugs, because I think it would like make a lot of companies very sad. But yeah, managing the cascade is like this really complex thing that I didn't really find a consistent variable of like large or small teams being good at managing the cascade. The teams that I saw that were the most fluid just had really, really shallow cascades where it wasn't something they had to manage a lot. But everybody, I would observe, like basically strove towards like getting their own concept of encapsulation. Things that you're starting to see with things like CSS modules, React, and like how it offers up like components on the front end. These are all ways to like scope your CSS and take them out of this like global scope. And people have been manipulating that through like creating really, really heavy selectors and just like traversing the DOM with like 15 different elements before they're going to style something. So the mental model has been there for a long time, and I think that like that's going to like be more in the future of like encapsulating things into the markup instead of these long selectors. So when people just want stuff to work, right? Like I'm convinced, I don't know that many people who love writing CSS, even people who like making UI. So Vim and Unix have been pretty impactful for me in like how I approach my project design, because I don't know, I just value in my own personal workflow learning really small bits so you can just like combine and compose, and learning these bits like really, really well. In Vim, this comes up like all the time, but Vim actually has really great documentation. And this looks really boring, and I would not fault anybody for not reading it. But if you actually just read it line by line, it's really well documented. It's actually not that dry. And they constantly present to you, this is probably the next problem you're going to try to solve, and this is the solution to that problem. And they really think about like your actual customer journey learning this text editor. And that's how I want the documentation for Tachyons to be. So we've spent a lot of time, myself and like some other open source volunteers, have spent a lot of time like walking through, doing card sorting exercises with people in the general public to see how they think about the information architecture behind like CSS and learning CSS. Because one of the things that I've observed is like everybody learns differently. Everybody has varying levels of agency. So how do you build something that like people all across that spectrum can actually absorb your styles? So this is where we want to get to. We're not all the way there yet. Our style guide's mostly self-documenting, but we still have a few things to automate. But yeah, we just really want like automated CSS and HTML docs. I've been on teams that their whole job is just to maintain a style guide. But the thing is you shouldn't really have to maintain it. It already exists. It's already your website. And you can build tools that just abstract that stuff out. So when I started to actually get serious about like putting this together, I was like collecting a lot of just utilities that were ubiquitous across every single project I was using. And I built this for me. I do all of my work out in the open, but open source is super weird. Because I do it out in the open because it's HTML and CSS. It's like your browser's downloading it anyway. You can take it and change it. You're not going to hurt me. But with this project, I like actually wanted to, like use it on a lot of projects. So a big part of that was making the tooling easy to like integrate with other frameworks. And I really love The Watchmen. It's one of my favorite graphic novels. And I really like Dr. Manhattan, this whole part about tachyons like screwing up his ability to see through time. Like what a kryptonite to have. But I also like this like sound of tachyons, like you're just tacking things on the HTML with the CSS. But my goal was to be able to manipulate UI like as fast as possible. I am probably one of the laziest people you'll ever meet. So like anytime I have to do something 2 or 3 times, I'm very upset. So I really wanted to never have to write certain types of CSS again. But all the things that I've worked on with tachyons, I'm like almost done with V4. It's coming out of beta very soon. But the thing is that most of these problems that I set out to solve are going to be pretty obsolete soon. Like right now, it is par for the course where you download all the CSS for the website. It's like cached, and that's just the world that we live in. And for Pinterest, that's like 168 kilobytes of CSS. I think GitHub has more than 100 kilobytes of CSS. And these are companies with like amazing front-end developers. But that's the norm. Like somebody wants to look at one page and we're like, here's 100 kilobytes of resources that you actually don't care about. Because realistically, you're probably using like 2.5% of that CSS. But things like React, there are a lot of neat tools that people are coming out with right now that you're only spitting out the CSS that your actual page needs, which I'm pretty excited about. But I'll show you some code now. So with Tachyons, like I said, I basically tried to, this is not my computer. This part of my presentation is a little borked. All right, so with Tachyons, I've talked a little bit about it in the abstract, but it's essentially tries to be a framework where you have to write a very limited amount of CSS, but you can build really whatever you want. So it's essentially becoming an API for CSS, right? There's only so many different properties or values for the property of display. So you just give classes for each one of those properties, and you can just reference it in your HTML. But you try to also allow for the designer to play to the strengths of any breakpoint, whether it's a tablet, a mobile phone, or a desktop. So you can set styles independent. You could set text to red only on desktop screens if you want, which I'm not saying is a good idea. But it allows for the flexibility of doing that. And it's only 7 kilobytes, gzipped and minified. And generally, I've used it on about 30 or 40 projects now, kind of with clients. And I generally have to write, an additional 20 or 30 lines of CSS. Oftentimes, it's like background images or brand colors, because no CSS framework could cover every combination of company's brand colors. But I get away without having to write new CSS all the time. And then so what I actually end up doing is collecting components. Like every time I build a component for a client, I kind of like sneak that into my little component collection. And then what you start to do is build this world where you can have a component and you can define rules for that component, right? So for a simple website that had a header, and you might have a title and a subtitle. As a designer, I'm going to design a different header for a header that's only 3 letters versus like 40 characters, right? So I can design 120 headers and say these ones are really good for long titles and short subtitles. These are really good for short titles and long subtitles. And then I can just start spitting out website designs based on the length of the content and like selecting components based on the strength of the actual component. So Tachyons is trying to attempt to eliminate writing redundant CSS and just allowing you to kind of like do your work in the browser. But like I said, a lot of stuff's going to be obsolete. I think the part that won't be though is the design systems and how all these values relate to each other, and the ability to work in an encapsulated flow, because 99% of the front-end development I see is people are going in there and they have to change 1 or 2 things about a UI. They're generally not building something up from scratch. It's like marketing told me to change this button color to orange and just this button, like no other button on the website. And trying to change that in the global cascade can be like super terrifying. So yeah, without the code demo now. My name is Adam, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be around after.